culture on Rembrandt in the late 1650s by pairing Rembrandt's 22 extant drawings of Mughal courtiers with Mughal paintings of similar compositions. Stephanie Schrader, in conversation with Naman P. Ahuja, in today's session, Rembrandt and the Mughals, presented by Getty Foundation series. Naman Ahuja is a curator of Indian art, professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and editor of Marg Publications. Most noted for his critically acclaimed exhibition and book on the body in Indian art and thought, he has recently co-edited The Arts and Interiors of Rashtrapati Bhavan, Lutyens and Beyond. Please welcome the speakers on stage.
Well, welcome. It's very nice to be able to see that a panel on art history is going to attracts this kind of attention. I've had the wonderful privilege of being on a fellowship at the Getty Foundation last year, where I happened to meet Stephanie Schrader, who's my guest here today. I've been busy co-curating an exhibition called India and the World, which is on at the CSMVS, formerly called the Prince of Wales Museum in Mumbai. And the purpose of that exhibition was to really explore the nature of the similarities and connections between India and the rest of the world, but also to be able to showcase the differences that we have in India from the rest of the world, or even within India, the many differences that exist, and how India has had the capacity to learn from the rest of the world. It was very easy to be able to come up with a narrative about all the many influences on India. But it was very difficult as a curator to be able to talk about how India might have impacted and had a visible and strong impress on the arts and cultures of other parts of the world. And so, I'd always known about the fact that there were these Rembrandt drawings that had Mughal subject matter, and I wanted in some way to be able to include that and show it in the exhibition. And since this exhibition was in collaboration with the British Museum, I made a request for some. I didn't know, however, that the Getty Foundation was also going to have a massive exhibition on the theme specifically of Rembrandt and the Mughals. That was being curated by Stephanie over here. And she had also put in a request to be able to get all the drawings from the British Museum that Rembrandt had made, which were copies of Mughal paintings. And so we met each other, and we got along really well. So she has in her show, which is going to open at the Getty next month.
Yes, March.
All the known Rembrandt drawings, bar one, which you'll have to go to Mumbai to be able to see at the moment. And then it so happened that the marvelous book that accompanies this exhibition.
Can we have the slide, please?
Oh,
great.
It was great that as co-editor of Marg, I was able to negotiate that Marg would be able to distribute and make this book available to readers in India. And so here it is, and if anyone wants order forms and discount vouchers or something like that, I have a few which I'm happy to distribute after our conversation about it. So, Stephanie, how did you get into this project? What were your motivations for doing this project on Rembrandt and the Mughals?
So I am a curator of Dutch and Flemish drawings, so I specialize in drawings from the Netherlands from the 15th century to the 18th century. And the Getty Museum happens to have one of these Rembrandt drawings in our collection. And it's something that I've always been curious about. How did Rembrandt know anything about India? How did he have any connection to India? We know he didn't travel. He never left the Netherlands. So how did India come to Amsterdam? And that's when I began thinking about this project, and I've been thinking about this project since 1996. I haven't been at the Getty that long, but I've come back and forth after my graduate studies. And I had this idea to bring them together. And as Naman said, there's 23 of them, and we had to to even begin thinking about how you do an exhibition, you have to see if all the venues will lend them to you. So can I have the next slide, please? So you see on the screen all the different places highlighted in yellow where the Rembrandt drawings are located. So there are 12 institutions, and we had to sort of convince everyone to bring them to the Getty. And that's when I found out that one of them wasn't going to be able to come because of Naman. So that's how we began. Can we have the next slide? And you see the Getty's own drawing here of Shah Jahan and Dara Shikoh.
One sec. Could I ask you to put the lights in the room off? Could you turn these lights down so that people can see the slides clearly?
Can you see them?
Yeah?
Okay. So you see an example here on the screen, and what you'll notice is they don't look like Dutch merchants, do they? This is not something that typically Rembrandt drew, and you see really minutely, meticulously rendered drawings full of details, turbans, jamas, the ruched pants, the upturned shoes, and the falcon, elaborate jewelry, the egret feathers, and men in conversation, but a very quiet, subdued conversation, one that is incredibly refined and really showing all the majesty and the glory of the Mughal Empire. So can we have the next slide? I'm going to give you a couple more examples. So you see Shah Jahan. I should tell you, Rembrandt made 8 drawings of Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan was Rembrandt's contemporary, and Rembrandt made these drawings in the last decade of his life. So after he had this glorious career, he somehow became in contact with Mughal compositions and copied them. Can we show one more slide, please? So you see examples here. Jahangir, Shah Jahan. So these give you sort of a sampling of what type of drawings will be in the exhibition.
Right. Tell me, in what way, looking at these drawings, do you feel that a study of these copies of Mughal paintings has changed our perception of Rembrandt? Is there any kind of palpable influence of Mughal art on Rembrandt's major paintings, or was this something that he was just whimsical about and sketching privately, or did it make an impact into the rest of his oeuvre as an artist?
Okay, so one thing you need to know about Rembrandt, he made drawings, he made them primarily for himself. So he would use drawings to experiment with ideas. He would use them to help train his pupils. He had over 50 pupils, and he charged them money. So he made money by having students, and the way you would train a student in the Netherlands is you'd have them copy your style. So in these drawings, what I see happening is that he's looking to the Mughal compositions to be the master, and he's the pupil now. So you see an inverted relationship about using his drawing style as a way to understand another art form. So it's an art form that he maybe could have known. Can we have the next slide, please? From his collection, that's been the theory. So I show you a picture here of Rembrandt's Kunstkammer, or his art room. We know Rembrandt was an avid collector. He had lots of what is identified in his inventory in 1656 as East Indian or Indian art. He had 60 weapons. He had an Indian costume for a man and a woman. He had boxes. He had cups. And so he displayed these types of objects in his art room so he could use reference. And I show you a picture of his house.
So he's basically the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, is getting objects from all over the world and bringing them to Amsterdam.
Yes.
And
true.
he's shopping. He's obviously really...
He shopped so much that he went bankrupt. That's how we know what he had in his collection, because in 1656, he overspent his income and had to sell everything he owned at a public auction, and we know what he owned because of this auction. And can I have the next slide? I want to show you the type of people that Rembrandt was associating with. These are merchants. So there's no royalty in the Dutch Republic. They're merchants, and the merchants are getting their money by establishing the Dutch East India Company, which is sort of like a multinational company that's trying to control the spice trade. But they're competing with the Spanish and the Portuguese and other nations. But these are your Dutch merchants here, wearing all black, very sober. And they're amassing a fortune by this trade. And Rembrandt is also amassing a fortune and able to buy luxury items. So the question is, did he own the compositions he copied? That's always been the question. Can we have the next slide? I just want to show you a picture of Surat, where this is a Dutch painting, sort of imagining what they think Surat looks like. And the next slide.
No, so hold on. What's the significance of Surat?
So that's where the Dutch had their trading post in India. So that's where everything was brought back from on Dutch East India Company ships back to Amsterdam.
And this business about collecting and having an inventory of Rembrandt when he goes bankrupt, how many Mughal paintings do you think he must have had?
Okay, so I actually don't think he owned the paintings. I think everyone has said he probably did own them because there's a note 203 in his inventory that says curious drawings. So they assume curious drawings must mean Mughal paintings. But we know in inventories at this time that the word for Mughal paintings was Suratsa tekening, meaning drawings from Surat. And the fact that it's not mentioned in his inventory makes me wonder if he saw them from somebody else.
So the word, again, for...
Suratsa tekening. So
Suratsa tekening.
Tekening means drawing in Dutch, and
Okay.
Suratsa means drawings
From
of
Surat.
Surat, yes.
And so Surat lends its name to the tradition of Mughal drawings, and you
Yes.
imagine, therefore, that they are acquiring these Mughal paintings and drawings in Surat or directly in Agra, because we know that the East India Company people, the Dutch East India Company people, have audience with the Mughal emperor, and they are negotiating trading relations with the Mughals. So they might have gone and seen the imperial atelier, and we know that they're bringing Flemish prints to India,
Yes,
and the Mughals are collecting their art.
yes.
So it could have been a very valid exchange that I'll give you some paintings
Yes.
in exchange of some of your paintings,
Yes.
which could have been a...
It could have been. I would love to tell you we know exactly how he saw them, but I'm trying to make this, we don't know, so I can't invent that he had them. Can we have
Were other contemporaries of
Yes.
Rembrandt also collecting Mughal paintings or
Yes.
Surat's tekeni?
Yes, so we know from inventories, there's been a lot of work done on inventories. So the Dutch like to write everything down. So we have a lot of inventories that describe Suratsa tekening in them, but we don't have actual examples of them still being in the Netherlands, except for the mayor of Amsterdam. He had a collection of 465 Indian paintings. So we think that those paintings weren't just collected in 1670, that they had a long period of collecting them. And we know that that mayor of Amsterdam, his son was the avid collector, but we think that he perhaps got some from his father, and his father lent Rembrandt 4,000 guilders to buy his house. So Rembrandt was very connected. One of his great patrons was the governor of Gujarat, the sort of the military governor of Gujarat. We know that he had Dutch East India Company lawyers as his patrons, governors. So these were all people in his circle, and I think they probably had the collections. And can we have the next slide? And I just want to point out this, the types of drawings, or the types of Mughal paintings that Rembrandt saw were of incredibly high quality. And I show you two examples of those types. One you see is from one of the maracas that is incredibly detailed. And another is a very interesting work that you might not know about. It's in the Vatican Collection. It was collected in 1630 by the Pope, Pope Urban VIII. And you see it doesn't have the decorated borders, but it does have the same type of quality and finish. So these were not tourist things that were just exported and not of any quality. They are of the highest quality. And all the compositions can be dated from visual comparison to from around 1610 to 1650.
Do we know anything more about how the Vatican got that painting? And
We don't. We know probably it came through Goa somehow, maybe, because it was earlier, and that's where the Catholics were. And it probably came through those channels as opposed to coming from Surat. And I show you one page from the album, but the other pages have entire genealogies of Mughal emperors and the sons and the wives and who's married to whom, and little medallion portraits of them.
so one of the things that comes to my mind is that, you know, in academic circles at least, when we look at one culture looking at another, and especially when you have Europeans looking at India, there is this, invariably this quality of exoticization of India that takes place in the way they look at India. And India is nothing more than a curiosity, a maverick, extraordinary, remarkable curiosity. And you wonder that, is there any real engagement with India? Because if Rembrandt is not utilizing, or Rembrandt and his peers who are importing these paintings and collecting them, is it just a feather in their cap that they want to have something from all over the world? You know, Pocahontas' mantle ends up at the Ashmolean on the one hand, and at the same time, the Vatican collects the odd lady in a harem, or a beautiful Indian Ragamala lady walking through a garden. Is it just exoticization of India, or does it really influence and touch the artists in Europe in some way?
Okay, so that's the key question, right? If it's just a passing fancy, why do we care? And we care for several reasons. One, can I have the next slide? Is because he draws in a completely different way when he sees the Mughal paintings. And I show you an example of his typical drawing style, this seated woman, and notice the broad brush. He's contrasting wet and dry brush. It's all about light and shadow. It's very volumetric. It's very evocative. It's suggestive. It is not detailed. It is not meticulous. It is not at all what you see when he looks at Mughal compositions. So it would be one thing if he did this once, right? He did it 23 times. Why would you need to make 23 copies? He copied Indian paintings more than he copied any other art. And that's significant. We know he copied Leonardo da Vinci. He copied him 3 times. We know he copied Titian twice, maybe. We know Raphael, he was interested, but 23 times? That's significant. And what's also significant is that he does it on Asian paper. So we know Rembrandt made prints on what we now call Japanese paper, but he never made drawings on this paper. So he's altering what paper he draws on, and he's altering the line in which he draws. So that, I think, is significant. Can we have the next slide? And yes, we know Rembrandt loved fantasy. We know he loved to dress up.
Stephanie, could you turn these lights off?
We're sweating to death up here.
Thanks.
And so I give you a late self-portrait. Rembrandt made many self-portraits. He was sort of obsessed with himself and his identity. And you see his fantasy here. So when he wants to be fantastical and imagine what costume from another era looks like, he can do it. He doesn't need to look at Mughal paintings to do that. Next slide. So instead, I show you an example here of him copying a 15th century Italian master. And you really see him trying to be like this other artist. So he does this when he looks at art that he doesn't know. This is part of his practice. And then,
so he is a good student all his life.
Throughout his career. That's typical for many European artists. Velázquez, same thing. So, and I just want to point out, next slide, how meticulous and detailed he is when he looks at these Mughal paintings. So I show you here, one of the things about this exhibition is that I've had the privilege to work with paper conservators and look at every single one of these drawings under the microscope. And when you look under the microscope, you see different things. And you see a detail of him drawing Shah Jahan's nose here. And he didn't like the way he got it. He didn't think he got the angle right, so he scraped it away with a metal stick and redrew it. So what you see there looks like white is actually him scraping away the paper to make a correction. So he wants to get attention to the physiognomy of these rulers. Next slide. And he even thinks about Shah Jahan having a white beard. All I've heard on my trip to India was how much he loved his wife and how he grew so sad after she died. So he's attentive to that type of detail. Next slide. And you see him even paying attention to the jama. This is an Akbar jama, so he pays attention to the way these jamas change over time. Next.
Right, so he's being really attentive in each of these paintings. I mean, that's a very distinctive stylistic feature of Akbari painting, the four-pointed jama.
Yes. And the red and white stripes.
And he gets the details. I mean, when he's copying an Akbari painting or when he's copying a Jahangiri painting, he has the subtle differences.
Yes. And I have one more example for you. So when he looks at, next slide, please. So when he looks at the Deccan, he knows that the turban's tied differently and the patterns are different. So these are all ways that I see him not just being fantastical or exoticizing, but really trying to study and learn.
Right. And is that similar to what his peers are doing as well? I mean, are other artists in Holland or in Europe doing the same kind of thing of copying Indian paintings in this way?
Okay, so can we have the next slide? So I want you to see what other artists do. So this is Willem Schellings, who's another Dutch artist. He's Rembrandt's contemporary, and he too has come in contact with Mughal paintings. And he's come in contact with them so much that he writes a poem about them. So I'm going to read you just because I think it's so interesting for you to know that poetry was written about Mughal paintings in the Dutch Empire. If I can find it. And basically I'll summarize it because it's maybe too poetic. But basically he's saying that Dutch art has to bow down to Mughal painting. That this type of painting is so good and so much better that it takes the crown from Europe's head. So that implies to me that they have more than just one encounter with Mughal painting. They have enough to write a poem about it, to have that poem published, and have that poem circulating. So even though he has this appreciation for Mughal painting, he does kind of make these fantastical, I think a little bit kitschy paintings that don't have the sophistication and the careful study. He's appropriating it and doing it for his own pleasure.
It's, for those of you who haven't noticed, if you look up, apart from the whole darbar, with these procession of fantastical animals, composite animals that are walking in the background, which is such a Deccani technique, and then in the foreground you have a large darbar hall with the shamiana, with the tented enclave, and then in the background, up in the sky, there is a conversation between, is that Akbar and Jahangir?
Yes.
So as if they are the great gods, the angels, who are up in the sky having this conversation up there. Can we see the next slide, please?
So here you see how Schellings and Rembrandt probably had access to the same type of composition. And you see Rembrandt's drawing in the middle, the type of composition that they might have seen, and Schellings the detail.
So that Mughal painting, which is on the extreme right, where is that?
That's in a private collection. So one of the great things about this exhibition, I've been able to work with scholars of Indian art in Los Angeles who have access to all sorts of treasure troves all over the world. And so a lot of there'll be, I'd say, about 7 or 8 paintings that most people have never seen before.
Because, I mean, that's extraordinary, the parallel between the Schelling painting, the Rembrandt drawing, and the Bichitra painting. So clearly that Mughal painting has moved out of India into a European context, and then the same painting is being copied by 2 contemporary Dutch artists.
Yes. Yes. And sorry, I cut the border because I needed it so you could see a better comparison, but it has this very elaborate border that connects it to the St. Petersburg maraca. So we know this actually was supposed to be with the others that are now in St. Petersburg.
So in terms of this kind of engagement with India, what you're trying to say is that different artists had a different kind of relationship with non-Western art.
Yes. And I have actually, I could give you other examples, but I don't have illustrations, so I'm going to turn the question now back to you, is that people say, well, Rembrandt, isn't this some form of, colonialism? It's not, because the Dutch were not colonizing India. Is it some type of exoticism? And then I turn the question back to scholars and say, well, Mughal artists did it too. They did it before Rembrandt ever did it. Can we have the next slide?
Yes, and we can see that over here in this example, that we do know that Mughal artists were heavily inspired by Flemish drawings and etchings and other European pictures that were coming into the court of the Mughals from the late Mughal period itself. And we know that they were trying to directly copy what they were seeing, because copying is an integral part of the studio's practice, and that is how artists are trained. And one of the things that Mughal artists got particularly excited about was verisimilitude, exact portraiture, perspective and depth, chiaroscuro, creating light and shade and having a singular light source coming into a painting, casting shadows. And the other thing that Mughal artists got quite inspired by from European etchings was cross-hatching. So when you see them actually, when you see Mughal drawings that are copying that tradition of European art, where you see the quality of line in Mughal painting starts to change. So whereas Rajput and Pahari and Mughal painting was known for its phenomenal draftsmanship, where a single unbroken line is used with great felicity to be able to compose entire scenes, and you see minimal corrections being made oftentimes because the draftsmanship is so fantastic. Cross-hatching allows for work to be built up in a way that Mughal artists don't normally do with the in monochrome. They do it with the shading in a style called neem kalam that comes up a little later, which is different because it's about shaded gouache washes and watercolor washes, which build up tonality as you would with watercolor. But it's not done with a brush to create cross-hatching. And that's a different technique that we are seeing these artists use. So Indian artists are certainly absorbing many elements of European art.
Wait, can we just go back from, I just want to point out one thing. So this artist, this Dutch artist, these types of engravings were very popular at the Mughal court. And we know this artist in particular, they sent close to 400 prints, the Dutch, to India of this artist in particular. So you just have to remember this whole conversation about art that we're having, trade is always sort of the Uber conversation there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, can we see the next slide, please? Yeah, here, exactly. I mean, it's very rare when we often see nativity scenes which are often about the birth of Christ. But scenes of the birth of Mary were particularly valued in certain Catholic traditions, and those are the traditions that made their way to India through the traders. And so this particular scene of the birth of Mary is a direct copy, as you can see, of a picture by Cornelius Cort. And even though it's made 100 years later, you can imagine that Cornelius Cort's picture is in the Mughal library, which is being copied by artists there. And the birth of Mary is particularly valuable in the Mughal context because it's the birth of Maryam. And Maryam is the lady that is mentioned most in the Quran and is the person who is, many Mughal queens are called Maryam. And so it could easily be an allegory for the birth of one of the Maryams in the court of the Mughals, where they used that particular Christian drawing but adapted it into a Muslim courtly context. Could we see the next slide, please? This is one of the examples of a Mughal artist directly copying a European painting or a European drawing. And it's probably made by Kesudas, but we don't know for sure because Kesudas was the artist who was most adept at copying Mughal paintings. Can we see the next one, please? Right. Well, that's a different thing. And so in the exhibition in Mumbai right now, what you see on the left is a drawing by Rembrandt where Jahangir receives a courtier. And what you see on the right is a painting from the National Museum in Delhi, which shows Jahangir holding up a tiny European painting of the Virgin Mary. So Jahangir is looking at European painting while Rembrandt is copying Indian painting. And we've put these two up together in the museum in Mumbai for people to be able to compare them. If you look at the next slide, I don't know how well you can notice it, but in the detail, can you see that Jahangir is actually holding up a painting, a European painting of the Virgin Mary? And that's a detail of Rembrandt's copy of Jahangir's portrait. Yeah, so I think there is an assimilation and an impact of European art on Mughal art, which is, on the one hand, associating the European culture with Christianity, and at the same time, it is interested in the technique of European art and the ideas of perspective and portraiture, verisimilitude, enter the canon of the repertoire of an Indian artist. And then you see something very interesting happen, that Indian artists absorb it and use it for a while and then discard it as well, and use it very selectively as a technique that they want to use sometimes.
They use it with purpose.
They use it with purpose.
Right. So what I also wanted to bring to bear on this, because I find it so relevant. So we know Jahangir, Sir Thomas Roe, who was an ambassador to the court of Jahangir, was trying to gain faith. He was trying to gain access to trade. And one of the ways that conversation happened was through paintings. So Sir Thomas Roe tried to show him these European paintings that he thought were so marvelous. And Jahangir, in a very powerful way, said, "Give me those paintings. I'm going to have my artist copy them." And so they went away, and they were brought back to Jahangir and to Sir Thomas Roe, and Sir Thomas Roe couldn't tell the difference, so the story goes, between the English original portraits and the Indian copies. And that type of power relationship was a game that Jahangir loved to play. It's like, you think you're powerful, I'm more powerful. And I can show you my artists are just as good as your artists. So I think that interest in imitation had this power relationship as well. So we have to keep all these things, trade, art, power, negotiation, diplomacy. These are all things that are at play in what to you and to many people just appear as pretty paintings.
So curatorially, how do we communicate this complexity to our respective audiences? You know, I mean, in the sense that if for the show in Mumbai, I was quite keen that people go to see the exhibition to be able to celebrate the history of India and feel proud, but not come away with a sense of jingoism that makes them patriotic in a way that denies difference, that doesn't allow them to feel respectful of how much Indians have learnt from the rest of the world, as much as they have been able to teach the rest of the world. For me, one of the challenges in communicating and bringing these paintings to the public, to an Indian audience, was that it's very different when you're sitting in a community and a group of people that is English educated and has traveled the world, and they've heard of Rembrandt, and they would be fascinated to know that Rembrandt made copies of Mughal paintings. Now go outside this room and just start talking to the janta at large and start asking them the same question, and everyone's going to turn around and say, "But Rembrandt kaun hai?" You know, I mean, kaun Rembrandt? Who's Rembrandt? And they don't know.
They don't.
So how do you introduce the Indian public to a great artist of Europe? Is very challenging as an Indian curator, and Rembrandt allowed me that bridge to be able to show an Indian painting of an Indian art connoisseur like Jahangir looking at a European painting, while there is a European artist looking at a painting of that Mughal emperor. And it made them sensitive to and start comparing the differences and similarities of how Indian art reaches Europe. Did you have similar curatorial challenges in communicating this story to an American audience?
Okay, so I have two stories in relationship to that. The first is that the Getty Museum Drawings Department, which I work, doesn't collect non-Western art. So we don't have any Indian paintings in our collection. So that was the first challenge. The second challenge was, to Rembrandt scholars, these drawings don't look like Rembrandt, right? So they've sort of been marginalized as something non-Rembrandt. Are they even by Rembrandt, some people have said. They look so not like Rembrandt, they can't be by him. So go back to that first, one of the first images you saw comparing the woman seated. That's what a Rembrandt drawing looks like. So what do you do, can I have the next slide, with something that looks like this? So my job was to bring Rembrandt, these drawings, back into the mainstream of Rembrandt studies. My job was to bring Indian art to the Getty Museum. We have great collections of Indian art in Los Angeles. We just don't happen to have them in my collection. And the best way, I thought, to make those conversations happen was by pairing, the same way that Naman did it, having a Rembrandt drawing on one side and a Mughal painting on the other, and have them close together so people could go back and forth. So if you show a lot of these drawings to curators of Mughal painting, they say, they're so messy. They're so not Mughal. And if you show them to a Rembrandt scholar, they say, they're so detailed. They're so meticulous. They're so not Rembrandt. So to get people over that kind of marginalized viewpoint, to have them have a conversation, and to make art the way you begin that conversation. So can we have another slide? So one of the ways that conversation, when you have that conversation, you notice Rembrandt does things that Mughal artists do not do. So he shows feet. He never can show them parallel the way Mughal artists show feet. He constantly has to have them turned out, or in this case, a foot elevated upwards. He always has these broad sort of bands of wash in the background. And Naman and I have been having this conversation. To me, it doesn't bring it to life, but to Naman, he said, no, Mughal artists would never do this. It's so not Mughal. So even today, we still have that dialogue. So the next slide, please. So here you see him trying to figure out the feet so much that he draws the feet again. He does it not once, but twice. And this is where I think, this is like the perfect drawing, that's why it's the cover of the book. This is in the collection of the Cleveland Art Museum in Ohio. It gives you a sense of him as a student, him trying to learn from the master here, and really trying to understand. And just because he doesn't go to India, just because he doesn't have that direct familiarity, doesn't mean he doesn't try to engage in some way.
That's so touching, isn't it? I mean, it really humanizes the way we think about this man who's gone through so many personal tragedies and lost all these children and gone bankrupt, and he never stops being a student all his life, and even late in his life, he is willing to learn new ways of drawing and experiment with new forms of art. And it's a very remarkable story. It does put... Do you think this exhibition is going to have an impact on Rembrandt studies?
Well, I hope so. The way we've written the book, is we have sort of like a senior scholar of Rembrandt drawings, and they're always men, and they're always over 60. So they write their narrative about how these drawings have been seen. They mostly write the story about provenance, who owned them, because we know these drawings were all owned by a British artist from the 18th century, and they were all kept in a collection together until 1747. So that, as a provenance story, as a history of ownership, is really fascinating. And that same scholar talks about why they are Rembrandt and they're not somebody else. And then in contrast to that, we have newer scholarship, which is me doing research about Dutch in India. And the same is true for the Mughals. So we have a senior scholar writing about the Mughal court and copying and the atelier and how that works. And then we have a younger scholar talking about what she thinks how the Mughal album was sort of meant to be dispersed. So the book is sort of serving as this compendium for the current state of affairs, and we hope that it moves from there.
Right. I think what's also emerging for us as art historians is to understand that our studies and our research is going further and further, and we never knew that there might have been collectors of up to 400 Mughal paintings that one person may have had in the 18th century or in the 17th century in Europe. And that got me thinking that we've always thought of Mughal paintings as being the arts of a book, either made to illustrate a history book or to illustrate some kind of a mythic narrative, a Hamza Nama, a Babar Nama, an Akbar Nama, and so on. And then in the reign of Jahangir, loose paintings are being made and are being put into murakkas, into albums. But this collecting that Europeans are engaged in, and the European traders are picking up in Agra or Lahore and taking from Surat to Europe, with people in Europe amassing as many as 400 pictures each, potentially, that really does make us think about what must have been the method of circulation. Because the Kitab Khana, the imperial atelier, the chateras, the artists, work specifically for that library in the precincts of that palace. And for them to have the permission to sell their paintings outside the palace to other consumers, that's very interesting, because it means that the studio had a certain amount of autonomy. And it makes us think again about how these foreign traders would have selected and seen the Mughal paintings that they wanted to buy. Mm-hmm. And that's opening up a whole other dimension about the role of art in Mughal society. It's also, even in terms of the influence of European art on India, I think there are so many new discoveries that are being made nowadays that we're completely changing our opinion on the nature of European impact on Indian art, which doesn't seem to be only biblical. It's very interesting that the Emperor Akbar, late in his career, because he was so fascinated with religion, attracted religious scholars of all denominations to his court, where major discussions would happen on different religions. And he sponsored a particular book called the Mirat al-Quds, The Life of Christ. And when it was recently published by Wheeler Thaxton, relatively recently, a few years ago, they found that Akbar was actually relying on so many different apocryphal traditions of the Bible that had come to him via the Armenians, through the Jesuits, through the Orthodox Church, through Constantinople remnants, as well as the South Indian St. Thomas Christians. And the kind of Bible that he creates, which is written in Farsi, it's very interesting that the emperor wants to create a Bible that will be readable to people in the Persian language. And then it's interesting that this person, this emperor, is also collecting so many biblical pictures and bringing them to his court. Now, at the same time, King James, who a little later also wants to put together a Bible in English for his population, is married to the sister of the Dutch king. And there is a connection that is building up. I mean, I'm sure she must have known about the fact that all the leading religious leaders are working in India at creating a Bible in their vernacular. And I keep wondering, slightly whimsically, did she influence her husband to create a Bible in English? I keep thinking about the fact that are there connections? But anyway, I mean, these kinds of connections apart, I mean, one also thinks about, are there connections outside of religion, where Indian artists are looking at the idea of Europe and they're trying to get different things from Europe, other than just a religious engagement with Europe.
And that's where the Dutch come in so handy to that narrative. Can we have the next slide, please? So here you see a Dutch genre scene, a pancake maker. There's nothing religious about this scene at all. It's a scene of everyday life. And I show you some Mughal artist whose name we still do not know, making this charming scene of a pancake maker. Can we have the next two slides, or the next slide? And you see Rembrandt here. This is a scene of making pancakes. I mean, if you've ever been to the Netherlands, they still eat pancakes. It's sort of like the dosa, but it's sweeter, and they have syrup with it. And it's a very common street food. It's something that you have at festivals, which is surprising. We're at a festival here, so we end with pancakes. And you see this old woman with these, very hungry customers all around her. You see a dog's even shown up to get a pancake. And this was a subject that Rembrandt made popular in an etching format. And he based it, again, on his collection. We know he had a painting of what was called a pastry cook. And I show you the print that forms the basis for the Mughal painting. And this somehow made its way.
Let's see the next slide. We're running out of time.
We're running out of time. So you see this type of comparison, and notice the Mughal details. How you want to talk about those?
No, that's fascinating. No, just don't want to. I mean, I think it's extraordinary that we have an ordinary genre scene like this. And I keep wondering what the Mughal library did with that painting.
Yes.
Where were they planning to put it? Which story were they going to incorporate it into? It just looks like nothing like any Mughal. I mean, they've done some differences. They're not going to have ordinary earthenware pots lying in front of the woman, and they've turned them into very expensive blue and white jars. And then the very ordinary wooden chair that pancake maker is sitting on has been turned into a beautiful Goan ivory chair.
So I think we'll end here, but just leave you with this thought about artistic imagination, inspiration. It comes in mysterious, beautiful ways. The best ways it comes is when it's unexpected. And we hope that you'll have questions for us so we can elaborate some of these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, there's in the British.
Where are you?
I'm right out here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, in the British Museum there is one of Rembrandt's sketches, which is described in the current web page as four.
Yes, Orientals sitting under a tree.
Four Orientals.
Yes.
And Schimmel identified this as the founders of the Sufi orders. What are your thoughts?
Well, I didn't hear the last part of the question.
Are they the Sufi orders?
Yes, they are. So this is a brilliant question because it gives you an indication of how all these drawings have been identified. None of them are really given any names. Those names, those titles have come as a result of the research I've done. So they're called things like Four Orientals Under a Tree or an Oriental on a Horseback. So they don't have a level of specificity. So you're absolutely right. That's exactly who they are, and they're based on...
That one.
Yes. They're based on a Mughal composition that's now in Vienna, in the Schönbrunn Schloss. Very good eye. Yes?
Is there any evidence of the Mughal influence actually surfacing in any of Rembrandt's paintings?
Okay, so there is not a lot. Some people have said details. There's certain details of a sword, perhaps, but not that type of same wrapping of that turban, no. Same use of an egret feather, no. Same tying of the jama, no. Yes.
Are we aware of any other examples of Western artists from other cultures, like Englishmen or Spaniards, who are copying Mughal paintings? Or was it only the Dutch, and if so, why?
Yeah. Well, I know mostly of the Dutch because that's my specialty. I don't have examples of it in my head of Italian artists doing it. I don't have it of French later with the French, but not in this time period. And I think you have to know something about the Netherlands. The way the Dutch identified themselves, the way they came into a nation, they're rebelling from Spain, who were their sort of overlords. They're trying to establish their independence. They're trying to be an independent nation. And one of the ways they do that is through global trade. So part of the narrative of this is that these drawings are Dutch because they're global, because they show their international cosmopolitanism. And the Dutch are very proud of that. And I see Rembrandt being part of that narrative. It shows him as an international player, it shows him as cosmopolitan, and he was in desperate need of money when he made these drawings because he had really fallen out of favor. And how else to show that you're still a player in the world stage by looking at Mughal painting that is a symbol of imperialism and grandeur and wealth and luxury.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I think an important thing is that we're looking at when a culture has the capacity to be able to import whatever it wants from different parts of the world. So we know that at this time, a lot of new research has shown that artisans' design books were being sent for manufacturing in Hoshiarpur or Surat or in Bengal, coming from Europe, and they were getting those products manufactured already in India. Then it was going from India to Malacca, to be caned and to be lacquered somewhere else. So the same object can have layers of craftsmanship from different parts of the world before it ends up back in the hands of the European customer who had commissioned it. So that's one answer, that you don't need to because you can get it done elsewhere. The second thing is that apart from painting, we should also be looking, to answer that question, we should also be looking at other things. We should be looking at jewelry, for instance. We should be looking at enameling technique. We should be looking at the methods of gem setting and gem collecting, what was going on. And there it would be easier to be able to trace the lineage of Indian gemstones and influences that are entering into the design houses and ateliers of Europe at that time. That makes it more possible to study that route of exchange.
Thank you very much for...
Right here, yeah.
Where?
After you.
Oh.
Thank you so much for a beautiful session. And
Sorry,
I take
will you
back...
stand up? I can't.
She is, right there.
Sorry, thank you. I'm blinded up here.
Thank you so much for a beautiful session. I take back a lot of information for my students back home. And I just have a simple question. Why doesn't the Rijksmuseum Museum, or Rijksmuseum as you pronounce it, now acknowledge the influence of Mughal artists on Rembrandt?
Oh, well, let me tell you, the Rijksmuseum has. They did an exhibition maybe 3 years ago, called Asia in Amsterdam, and they did an entire room based on these drawings, looking at their Indian paintings. It was an excellent exhibition, and so they really have. And if you go to the Rijksmuseum, since it's reopened, they have an entire section all about the Dutch East India Company. So they really have, and all this work from the Rijksmuseum, it's all online, it's all easy accessible. So the British Museum, different story.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. My question is, while we are seeing a lot of visual material, is there literature that is also coming in? So is he only looking, and not just, is he looking at these paintings to copy them, but as we're translating from various languages into Persian, is there poetry, are there stories that are also going back to the Netherlands?
I see that happening much later in the Netherlands. I think at this time it's more about the art, and it's more about the collecting mania.
Travel writing.
Travel writing. There's
Yeah.
travel. And
Travel
I should tell you
writings.
that the Thomas Rowe Chronicle of his visit, Jahangir's court, that is translated into Dutch in 1656 and circulates as like a newspaper.
So there are, yeah, and also in Latin there are.
Yes, in Latin there's a chronicle as well. Sorry, that was published in 1631.
Yeah.
But in terms of taking, amazing poetry from the Mughal court and having that translated
That
into
happens
Dutch,
100 years later.
that happens later.
100 years later, that wave of translating Indian literature, drama, as well as philosophical and religious texts would start being translated into European languages in the 1700s.
But we do have an example of one of Rembrandt's contemporaries he was a Dutch artist that went to earn his living in Batavia, which is Jakarta, and he traveled to India and brought a manuscript about Vishnu back to Jakarta and dedicated it to the governor of Jakarta to try to get himself out of legal trouble. Yes? The man in the black and white sweatshirt? You? Yeah.
You mentioned that the Mughals copied the European paintings for some time and then they discarded the style. So I just wanted to ask, has it had some permanent effects on the Indian art, like copying the European art, or did they just use it for some time and discard it and forget about it?
So it starts in 1590s, right?
Yeah.
When the Portuguese are trading.
1590s it starts, and then by the time you reach, some aspects of it get completely absorbed into the Indian tradition. Portraiture certainly lasts and keeps getting adapted. But there is a quest towards a certain kind of abstraction and idealization. There is a kind of a love of two-dimensionality rather than always sticking to single-point perspective. When they do want to play with perspective, it is an idea of playing with multiple perspectives on the same plane and to be communicated on the same plane. And so with the gradual collapse of the Mughal atelier, these artists do carry on these traditions in Murshidabad, as well as in some Dakhni courts, as well as in certain parts of Rajasthan. But by and large, these artists take their training and move into a very different kind of style when they are working in Rajasthan as well as in the Pahadi areas.
Yes, sir?
Good afternoon, actually, good evening. So I was actually wondering, British East India Company had many, traveling artists like Tilly Gettle, Thomas and William Daniels. Whether the Dutch East India Company also had, traveling artists, if there's any record of them, or were they responsible for actually, taking back some of the artworks which were under Mughal, and then, so have you ever thought of that? Have you ever worked on that?
So the one artist I talked about with the Vishnu, he did travel. So he was an artist, and the Dutch East India Company employed him because they knew he would be good with Shah Abbas. So they used him to help gain entrance through his art. And in fact, when the Dutch East India Company fired him for stealing, the Shah Abbas hired him so that he could be the court painter. And then the Dutch East India Company decided they wanted him back. So the artists were really sort of involved in direct ways, but they had to sort of succumb ultimately to the Dutch East India Company. And I should also point out that the Netherlands is a very small country, and we have records of artists leaving to go all over the world to try to make a living, because there were artists like Rembrandt back in Amsterdam that they couldn't compete with. So you see them going to every single Dutch trading post to try to better their life. And working for Shah Abbas was probably much better than being a servant to the Dutch East India Company.
Okay, we have time for one last question, so we better do it quick.
Is there any known occurrence of one of Rembrandt's drawings making it back to India, or of the Mughals ever discovering this sort of influence on Rembrandt's paintings?
No, not specifically on Rembrandt.
But we can ask one more. Both of you over here had a question.
Yes.
Do you want to answer?
Quick, ask.
Quick. We have 30 seconds. Color. So Rembrandt never used color when he made drawings. So he always drew in black chalk, red chalk, or pen and brown ink. Other Dutch artists did use color, Rembrandt didn't. So the fact that you saw examples of him using a little bit of red chalk wash in the turban and also in the stripes, that was remarkable. The fact that he did sort of pick up that sense of color because he doesn't use it any other time. Okay, we're getting flash. But ask her a question, maybe they'll cut us off.
When you were showing the comparisons of Mughals being influenced by the Europeans, they're taking perspective and they're taking colors and everything. But in Rembrandt's case, being a Northern Renaissance painter, they're all about realism, proportion, but he's specifically just concentrating on the figures in the Mughal paintings. No colors, no floral patterns or anything else.
So remember, Rembrandt made his money by being a portrait artist, right? So if you were wealthy and you could afford it, he would paint your portrait. That was his bread and butter. Even though he had aspirations to be a history painter, to paint biblical subjects, which he did, the way he made his money was by painting portraits. And what are these Mughal paintings? They're portraits. So he's astute, he's engaged, he's interested in seeing other artists' portrait conventions. So that's it. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Naman and Stephanie, for this interesting session. It was presented by Getty Foundation Series. Music stage at Clark's Amer begins at 6. Catch some of the world's most distinguished contemporary poets giving spoken word performances accompanied by specially composed music by the Jazz B-Stars. Next session here at the Bar Hall would be at 3:45. Girls are coming out of the woods. Ishani Doshi, introduced by Jeet Thayil.